You've got one weekend left to make your final push on the Marvel Snap ladder, and Infinite Conquest is open. Let's go ahead and break down what's performing well in Marvel Snap as our season comes to a close. Kick off by Jeff's picks this week with an incredibly disruptive Darkhawk shell. So, the Darkhawk package, in and of itself, does a phenomenal job of disrupting combo decks by breaking up the cards your opponent draws in a given game. Things like Iceman and Mobius directly disrupt whatever your opponent is playing out from hand, and Luke Cage and Armor do a phenomenal job of protecting our cards that are on the board. I think Luke Cage in particular is pretty well positioned right now. There's a lot of these kind of toxic Spectrum decks running around playing things like Man Thing or US Agent that Luke Cage can protect our cards from. He also does a phenomenal job of mitigating variants from another number of locations, and he's a key enabler for our latest card release, Valentina, that we're playing in here, meaning he undoes that penalty that she applies to your 6 energy card. While Valentina is definitely powerful in tandem with Luke Cage, I don't think she's a make or break card for this particular deck. If you're missing her, you'd want to substitute something else that can provide stats on the board for you. Something like, say, Cull Obsidian, or maybe even Werewolf by Night or Gladiator could all slot into her position pretty reasonably and let this deck operate in a very similar manner. My second Jeff's pick this week is what I've been calling Little Collector. It's another Valentina deck, and I do think she's more core to this one than she was in the previous Darkhawk shell that we looked at. Essentially, we look to grow our scaling threats, i.e. Angela and the Collector, with effects like Kitty Pryde or Jeff, who can deploy to Angela's space and then move away. And then Valentina serves the key role of not only being a third way to put a big number into play potentially, but also triggering the Collector to grow. This deck rounds out its scaling stat sticks with a plethora of disruptive options. Mobius is really important in any decks like this right now to have game into Loki, and Jean Grey does a phenomenal job of taking US Agent and allowing it to provide 11 or sometimes even 15 points worth of power for just 2 energy. Moving along to our high potential category, we have a roundup of deck lists that have really impressive stats so far on the untapped tracker, but are smaller sample sizes at the moment. Any of these decks could be the next breakout thing. Our first high potential deck list this week is an interesting Hope Summers Good Stuff deck. This deck list essentially looks to use the extra energy from its namesake to potentially ramp out multiple 6 energy bombs over the course of the game in the form of Doctor Doom and Magneto. Past these, this deck also has a variety of interactive elements to kick your opponent's sandcastles in a variety of ways, thanks to Shang-Chi, Shadow King, and Red Guardian. This deck list also sports a variety of cheaper ways to add stats to the board past its 6-drop. You have Gladiator as just an impressive 3 energy card. You have Miss Marvel providing 14 points of power for just 4 energy. And you have Jeff and Kitty Pryde that give you a lot of flexibility to spread your stats around the board. The last couple of slots in this deck round out with a Stature package who, thanks to Hope Summers providing extra energy, you can play Stature out as a 1 energy 7 power card alongside a 6-drop bomb on the last turn of the game. Our next high potential deck list this week is a Sandman tempo deck that essentially looks to get lots of stats on the board early and then play Sandman on turn 5 when you're ahead to keep that lead. It features 2 6-drop bombs at the top end of the curve, Doctor Doom and Red Hulk, that allow you to either go wide across all the lanes or go tall in a single one, depending on what the situation calls for. This deck list gets that early stat boost going with 2 drops like Medusa and Lizard that provide 5 points of power, movable cards like Nightcrawler and Jet that can be flexible based on where your opponent deploys, and 3 energy cards that have far above rate stat lines in Gladiator, as well as Baron Zemo, who doesn't have any synergies here like Yondu, but is just being played as a 3 energy card that's regularly going to provide 7 or more points of power. Our next high potential deck list is a Pixie variation featuring War Machine with a couple different plans of attack. War Machine can obviously let you deploy things like Ebony Maw and Infinite at key moments when you otherwise wouldn't be able to play them, but he also has synergy with this deck's lockout tool, Professor X, which you can accelerate aggressively onto the board thanks to Pixie and Renslayer, and even when you miss, meaning your opponent is able to have more points wherever you slam him down, War Machine can make up for that after the fact back by slipping in extra stats before the game ends. This deck list plays a number of scaling 1-drops in the form of Nebula and Sunspot, and because we're ready to soak up the energy into Sunspot anyways, in addition to Infina, we also leverage She-Hulk, which not only work fantastically with Pixie shuffling lower costs on them, but Magic providing us with a 7th turn of the game via Limbo can let us pass on 6 and then slam down over 30 points of power in that final moment of the game. Blob is an especially interesting inclusion in this deck that's kind of a backup Infinite in a lot of ways for when you don't draw your 620, but he also notably only has base 0 power now, so he can be a 5 energy play for us when Ravonna is out. Our last high potential deck list this week is an older deck that fell off the face of the metagame but showed up with good stats on Untapped and a smaller sample, Discard featuring Strong Guy. In addition to Strong Guy, this deck list gets to play Meek, Morbius, Dakin, and Dracula as cards that play out for cheap energy costs that scale up into big stat lines when we're hitting our stride and discarding our cards effectively. Proxima Midnight's also a really impressive card that lets this deck add surprise stats to the board in a way that's difficult for opponents to predict. This deck list really shines against lockout style shells that have been popular lately. Things like Storm and Professor X aren't really fantastic when this deck has scaling threats that it can deploy to the board early. While this deck list is definitely a little bit weaker after both Apocalypse and Meek were nerfed, in my experience, it still has the tools to keep up with in the metagame, and I'm really surprised how much it fell off given how strong it still consistently feels to play. Moving along to our top performing category, we have a deck list that's graduating from the high potential category last week, and that is Gene Spectrum. This deck really feels like it's taken Marvel Snap by storm, putting up impressive metrics in thousands of games logged on the ladder, and is one of the leading early best performing decks in Infinite Conquest as of my recording of this roundup. This deck list has a variety of incredibly disruptive tools, from Mobius and Luke Cage to Armor and Cosmo to the next namesake Jean, who pairs wonderfully with all these disruptive elements, forcing your opponents to play bigger on reveal effects into her lane. This deck list tops off all of these cheap disruptive cards with Spectrum, who often provides over double digits points worth of power all across the board in a way that's difficult for your opponents to keep up with. You'll note that this deck is playing US Agent. You can easily replace that with something like Lizard or another cheap ongoing card like Goose that you enjoy playing. I will say that the deck's namesake Jean Grey is a must-have for this deck. Without her ability to control where people are playing on the board, a lot of your other cards tend to fall short, like Nebula, Mojo, and the Punisher. Our next top performer this week is an interesting take on Silver Surfer featuring Mockingbird. My big takeaway on this archetype's strong performance so far is that Mockingbird doesn't really need as many enablers as a lot of us thought she did when she was first released. This deck list in particular is only playing Brood as well as Baron Zemo as well as Absorbing Man to duplicate their effects to make her cheaper, but you have Sarah to discount her as well, in addition to all the various locations that add squirrels or ninjas or raptors that can make her even cheaper as well. This deck list gets to play some interactive elements, primarily in the form of Killmonger, who also acts as an additional way to put points onto the board thanks to Nova blowing up and spreading stats all around. One of the big things to keep in mind when you're playing this variation of Surfer is that when Hope Summers and Sarah get together, playing Sarah into the Hope path on turn 5 gives you 7 energy and a discount on the last turn, which lets you play 3-drop Surfer and Absorbing Man all in one fell swoop, creating a big swing that's difficult for your opponent to predict. Our next top performer this week is the Pixie Lady Deathstrike deck. This was originally a brew on the channel that then had high potential, has now been a top performer for the last couple of weeks now. I think it's a pretty textbook example of why this deck is good in Marvel Snap. Not only is it doing something objectively powerful at its core with the Annihilus package in tandem with Red Hulk at the top end of the curve, but Pixie is really key to this deck in creating strong cube equity games. It's very difficult for your opponents to know whether they should be staying or retreating when they don't know what costs your cards have. It could be, a 6 energy Spider Ham in your hand, but it could also be a 1 energy Red Hulk or Lady Deathstrike that's going to completely blow them out. The noteworthy thing about this archetype this week is that the best performing variations of it are playing Shang-Chi now, and this makes a lot of sense from that cube equity perspective that I was talking about a moment ago. The established builds of this list up until now have not been playing Shang, and he's definitely at his absolutely most powerful when people aren't expecting him as a tech card in your range. I would wager as people get more used to Shang-Chi potentially being a part of this deck, his value will go down a little bit as people will be able to play around it a little bit more consistently. Our last top performer this week is again Hela. This deck has unfortunately been gaining in popularity due to the fact that it's a natural counter to Loki, who we'll be talking about in our most popular decks category here in just a moment. Moving along to that most popular category, Baron Zemo mill style decks continue to be the most popular. I would assume this is for twofold reasons. The first is that people just love taking cards out of their opponent's decks because they know people find it frustrating. And the second is Baron Zemo had weekend missions recently, which certainly increased its play rate, just like it's going to increase again this weekend as people look to collect their 375 gold. It is noteworthy that pouring over all the different Baron Zemo mill lists, this variation that I have featured on the screen right now, playing specifically Silver Samurai, Black Bolt, and Stature, did have standout metrics above the other variations of this archetype being played. That being said, its total overall stats are still pretty middling because this deck is definitely more frustrating to play against than it is good. Our second deck in the popular category and the last deck in this video is none other than Loki. This is a card slash archetype that there's always so much complaining about in the community when it is remotely popular. And as I've often pointed out here in the past, the performance metrics of this deck just don't match the volume of complaining in my experience. It is definitely popular. It's number 2 with certainty, no matter how you slice the data, on Untapped for popularity, but its performance metrics would not get it into the top performing category. It's why it's purely in the popular category this week. Noteworthy inclusions are that you'll note I have a build of Loki here playing Cable as opposed to Valentina. Looking at the stats on builds that are playing Valentina in that slot, they are performing worse than the builds playing Cable. I think from a theory perspective, this makes sense to me. If you're going to be Lokiing away whatever cards your 2-drop generates anyways, you might as well get a little bit of information that Cables provides as opposed to looking at a random 6-drop that you're ultimately going to turn into something else. Other noteworthy piece of Loki tech this week is that Cosmo is being included in the better performing builds. I would assume in part as an answer to Hela, which often rises up as a counter to this deck. Marvel Snap has been the most fun it's ever been for me since they reworked Zabu and Alioth. I think it's hard to put into words how much those two cards together had a stranglehold on the format. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to see what card changes and buffs will be coming in the OTA next week and getting my hands on Blink and Nocturne in the season rollover on Tuesday. I think the format's in a great spot overall, and it really feels like you can play almost anything so long as you have a cohesive game plan that's a little bit interactive and also put some numbers on the board. I would love to hear in the comments down below what you've been making your final Infinite pushes with or what you've been having success with in Infinite Conquest. As always, if you enjoyed my roundup this week, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of the wonderful content I put out here many days of the week.